Now, the Auditor-General of South Africa has painted a very bleak picture to Parliament of the financial situation of state-owned entities in the country. Now, the AG presented the outcomes of the 2019-2020 financial year yesterday, and the Financial Committee on Public Accounts, or SCOPA, was briefed by the AG on the Development Bank of Southern Africa, or DBSA, the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, PRASA, Denel, Eskom and the SABC, as well as Transnet. Now, the AG indicated all entities are regressing rather than improving, and that there's a sharp increase in irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure at some of these or most of the SOEs. And there was no audit for South African Airways, as that entity is still under business rescue. So SCOPA says it views the regression in these audit outcomes in a very serious light. And we're joined now by political and social analyst Eusebius Mckaiser to unpack some of these latest developments. Eusebius, good to have you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina. It's always a pleasure being in conversation with you and the viewers.
So this is not the first time that we see this sort of audit outcome for our SOEs. But perhaps it would be a good point to just start by going back a little bit and looking at what exactly is the mandate of these SOEs in a developmental state?
That's an excellent starting point, Sakina, because before we talk about the crisis and looking forward to solutions for how we're going to deal with the current crisis, it is important for the average citizen to take a deep interest in the state of SOEs. So it raises an obvious question: why are SOEs even important? And the reason they're important, Sakina, is because, for better or worse, South Africa has a very muscular state, a state that wants to be more than just a neutral observer of what happens in the economy. And so going back all the way to the apartheid era, and we've dragged this strategic position into the post-apartheid era, the state always imagined itself to be part of an economy where certain state-owned entities are created to try and help the South African economy to grow, and for us to be on a high growth path that is also conducive to obviously dealing with the unemployment crisis and hopefully subsequently inequality and poverty as well. And so whether we talk about Transnet, whether we talk about PRASA, Denel, SAA, the idea was that the strategic posture that the post-apartheid government would adopt, that is continuous with what happened before 94, is that part of the engine of the economy is that our SOEs would help to create conditions in which the South African state can be a player and not just take a minimal attitude towards what happens in the market. And unfortunately, which we'll get to in a second or three, the reality is that the governance issues, the operational issues that have always had been a sort of constraint on the effectiveness of our SOEs have never been dealt with for all sorts of reasons that we can drill down into.
So, and as we move into that sphere, I'm reminded of the late Auditor-General Kimi Makwetu saying that, when he deals with these reports, it feels like he's wrestling with a pig in the mud. And obviously you cannot win because you see the same thing over and over again. So how long are we going to be on this trajectory for? How long are we happy to go down this path? Given that, if you think back, Eusebius, in the 2000s, early 2000s, you had Eskom as, the foremost power utility, not only in South Africa or in the continent, but in the world. You had an entity like SABC that was the employer of choice when I first got here in the mid-2000s. And there are so many of these state-owned entities that have gone from being the envy, at the pinnacle of their respective sort of portfolios to now being just these dire, hopeless entities. What happened and how do we change trajectory?
Sakina, there's a tissue of issues that you raise, and they are excellent and very important. When I don't wear my hat as an analyst, I wear my hat as a broadcaster, and as a fellow broadcaster, you know how almost embarrassing it is to interview the AG annually, because the numbers change in the reports, but the patterns remain the same. And that raises the question, what is the history and how did we get here? And that's exactly to your point. Strategically, operationally, and also in terms of governance, there is a cycle and a pattern that keep being repeated when it comes to how our SOEs function. How did we get here? Well, sadly, because SOEs are a trough where the pigs that are in the mud that you are talking about also feed off the troughs. So you cannot divorce today's conversation from state capture, Sakina. The reality is that those thugs who steal from the public purse have often gone to SOEs and have found that to be the easiest way into the state, to be completely rapacious and to get their proboscis into the public purse by being on the boards of many of our SOEs, like SAA, for example, like Eskom. And so when we look at very specific examples, say, for example, the relationship between Transnet and Eskom, very often in those cases, you don't find an optimal synergy between two SOEs that are meant to work together strategically. And the reason is that the most corrupt people in our society, both from the private sector and within the public sector, went into our SOEs, and the SOEs have been central to the state capture project. And if we put it most simply, the reason why SOEs don't function as optimally as they should in South Africa is because they have also been the easiest parts of the state for looting to happen.
So if we look at the inefficiency of those who are meant to run these state-owned entities, and if we look at, for example, the mismanagement that we see on a large scale, the unethical conduct, is this what ultimately leads to the mismanagement of funds and the irregular expenditure that we see ballooning? Or is it simply that this culture has now become so ingrained that it is what it is?
Yeah, it is partly a cultural issue, so it's become systemic. So the unethical behavior has become normative. And when unethical behavior becomes normative, it doesn't matter whether you spray the words Batopele in the foyer of the SOE building. If the culture that you're talking about that has taken root is one where there are no longer disincentives to be unethical, including in how you manage money, including whether you respect Public Finance Management Act, including your talent attraction strategy or lack thereof, there is an organizational cultural problem. So you spot on, Sakina, there is a cultural problem. There are many others, and we don't have enough time, but I want to give one or two other practical examples so that we move this out of the realm of theory. You also find basic operational inefficiencies in many of our SOEs. There's an example I shared with you as part of our preparation yesterday in how, for example, Transnet relates to Eskom. One of the strategic reasons why there's meant to be a relationship between those two entities is that with coal-fired power stations at Eskom, we are meant to keep the cost curve as low as possible by making sure that another part of the state helps Eskom to achieve that outcome. So what does that mean? It means that your trains should be able to be relied on to bring you coal from the mines all the way to the power stations and back again. But that relationship is one that breaks down because you find the trains are not reliable. The turnaround time is not optimal. A train can simply break down in the middle of its journey, and then the next thing you know, you have energy insecurity on the part of Eskom. Part of it is because of internal problems at Eskom, but part of it practically is also because it can't rely on its strategic friend within the state, which is called Transnet. Now, here's the point that I'm trying to make. One of the cost curve pressure points within both Eskom and Transnet is that as a result of these inefficiencies, you then develop a bureaucracy within the bureaucracy by then asking, for example, McKinsey to come in and to do the job that men and women who are employed within the SOEs are meant to do. And then you have an extra line item suddenly where billions of rands leave the state for management consulting firms that are doing the work that employers within SOEs are meant to do. And then, Sakina, it is a very short story from there to the presentation we saw yesterday, where you have this incredible astronomical ballooning of the cost curves.
Now, Eusebius, the Auditor-General also found that there is a lack of consequence management, and we keep talking about that. You know, it's just become a buzz phrase, but what does it actually mean when we're talking about the actual outcomes as per the audits that were conducted in these state-owned entities and those responsible for the financial management, the accounting officers? Because there are instances where there is no evidence of any investigations into this behavior and the ultimate outcomes. There's no investigations into the irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure. So what's your view regarding all of this?
Firstly, my view is that as we move this conversation towards the solution space, I think you have flagged the single most important theme when it comes to the solution space, and that is consequence management. I prefer calling it accountability. We need to enhance accountability within our SOEs, and that means heads must roll, firstly. Secondly, if someone is incompetent, but not necessarily unethical from a technical point of view, they should be fired. And let's take an awkward example, SAA, or another awkward example is the SABC. If you have, for example, staff that are useless, I don't want to pay for them. As a taxpayer, we don't live in a communist economy where we have full artificial employment and you have folks that are part of your human resources organogram, but who don't necessarily perform the function. You've dealt very well on the show with some of the municipalities in the Eastern Cape where you've had that kind of problem. And we can't afford to have useless people, unethical people not delivering. So they need to be fired. And where they've been criminal, we need to make sure that we also have consequence management in relation to making sure they don't just resign, which is a very easy opt-out of being held accountable, but that actually you press charges and you make sure that criminal behavior actually has legal sanction behind it. But you can't do that, Sakina, unless you fix another part of the problem going forward, which is the boards and also the senior management. Very often, some of those looters that I was alluding to that have been at the heart of the state capture project, one of the ways in which they position themselves to steal from you and me as citizens is by getting onto the boards where they have enormous power. And I suspect you're going to have a self-standing conversation on this show just talking around the ethics of appointments to the board and making sure that boards themselves are actually behaving appropriately.
You're right. That is a conversation all on its own. But what we've seen in the South African context, especially as it relates to state-owned entities, is that you almost have this elite group of people who move from one state-owned entity to the next. And you know, absolutely amplified when you look at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, for example, where, oh, when I was at that entity, when you were at that entity, and you see the same people moving around. And it's not just them, it's members from the private sector as well who are included in this elite group of people who are always seemingly chosen to make up the boards of these entities. Now, when you look at political interference in the operational and accountability structures of these entities, how then do you deal with these issues that you've just flagged?
Yeah, look, I mean, we can't talk about this without talking about political accountability as a species of accountability in general. And the reality is that the governing party of the day has got to deal with those ministers that are the political head in charge of public enterprises. And we have very short attention spans because the news cycle moves on way too quickly. If we take, for example, former Minister of Public Enterprises, Malusi Gigaba, or as I prefer calling him, Maluti Gigupta, there you have an example of someone that was groomed by nefarious private sector interests to use the boards to get the preferred men and women onto them. And then they become, as you rightly point out, Sakina, professional board hoppers who go from one board to another board, and from there picking up the phone and saying, hey, make sure that Eusebius becomes the next SABC COO or whatever the case might be. So that has been the modus operandi of the looters. And here the ANC government, because it's the government of the day, the ANC is a political party, must take responsibility for the quality of men and women that they second, not just to Parliament, where you often have a lack of effective oversight over public enterprises, but also we've had some shockingly poor ministers in charge of this very strategically important ministerial post. Malusi is one example. Lynn Brown, or Lynn Brown-Nose, as I prefer referring to her, is another example. And the question is, why does the ANC keep reproducing this kind of lack of leadership? So the ANC itself has got to be put on trial for how it is mismanaging a strategically important part of the political economy.
So we're out of time, but before we go, can I quickly ask you about former President Jacob Zuma and what is going on now around the State Capture Commission of Inquiry? And of course, I'm sure you saw the communication that has been put out, but he, of course, it remains to be seen whether he in fact does go to the commission, whether he in fact will defy, or whether something will happen in the meantime. But just a quick one, your view on all of this.
I secretly hope you'd sneak this in as a postscript question, so thank you for doing that. Very quickly, I think it is an enormous constitutional crisis that should be politically avoided. The president is allowed to say, the former president, I don't agree with the court, and I don't agree because of reasons A, B, and C. However, as a constitutional Democrat, I'm committed to the rule of law, and therefore I will grudgingly comply with it. That is what he should be doing. He hasn't done that. He is undermining constitutional supremacy, and the biggest disappointment for me is not his behavior, because it is predictable and it's part of his Trumpian lack of respect for the law. The biggest disappointment is the ANC has not come out bluntly and said, the former president is undermining the Constitution, not in our name. And in fact, this behavior is unacceptable for any ANC member. We're going to proceed to discipline him. And the reason the ANC can't do that, Sakina, is because itself is politically and morally bankrupt and deeply divided and doesn't have the moral resources and capital to deal with Jacob Zuma.
And of course, we'll see how far that one goes. But just another question, going back to our initial discussion that I meant to ask you. You spoke about, consulting firms, and it's not just them, it's the auditing firms as well that are partly problematic in where the state finds itself in. So in terms of that, do you feel that there has been accountability in that regard? And if so, has it been sufficient?
No, there hasn't been, because what we need is a public, a very transparent overhaul of all of these different parts of the system. When it comes to auditing firms, accounting firms, they have completely lost credibility as a result of being in cahoots with many of the corporates to which they are clients that are in relationships with the state that are absolutely unacceptable relationships where they end up stealing from the public purse. And we cannot have trust in auditing and other companies that are meant to do oversight work within the state or within the private sector unless they demonstrate what is the plan of action to actually turn around the reputational damage that they are suffering, Sakina. And thus far, we have not seen an action plan, let alone one that has been publicly executed to demonstrate that they are actually repairing what went wrong in terms of the culture that had become part of the normal, unacceptable way of doing business.
And just a final question with regard to the Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture. Do you believe that the Commission itself has focused sufficiently on the role of the private sector?
I don't think it has. I mean, it's sort of done so parenthetically. I think there are examples, like, for example, take a company like McKinsey, where the Commission clearly understands that it takes two to tango. For every person within the state who is corrupt or corruptible, you have someone in the private sector that is willing to be in I almost said symbiotic, but that's too positive, to be in a really nefarious relationship with one another. And so this idea that you have corruption uniquely concentrated within the state is obviously empirically false. Corruption is relational, and the relationship is between entities willing to be completely unethical. And in that sense, although the Commission has touched on the private sector, it hasn't really gone there. But what I would say is, finally, Sakina, is that it can't really go there, because then you would have scope creep. It has a particular mandate, and only to the extent that the mandate focuses on state capture rather than societal capture, only to that extent is it able to go there. Otherwise, to use a management consulting phrase, you're going to end up trying to boil the ocean, which is an impossible task, and then the Commission will sit for decades to come.
Eusebius Mckaiser, thanks so much for your time this morning. Eusebius Mckaiser is a political and social analyst talking to us about the Auditor-General's dire audit report on state-owned entities that was presented to Parliament yesterday.